In 38 CE, when Rome's marble temples gleamed under the Mediterranean sun, the empire stood at its zenith, a realm that believed itself eternal. But even in that brilliance, something malignant stirred beneath the polished stone. Power had grown decadent. Virtue was now a costume. And into this glittering theater of illusion stepped a girl whose name would one day drip with infamy. Valyria Messalina. She was 15. Barely a woman, yet already promised to the most powerful man in the world. Emperor Claudius, uncle to the mad Caligula, survivor of court intrigues, a man mocked for his limp and his stammer, but feared for the imperial seal he carried. He was old enough to be her father, cautious, weary, and desperate to stabilize an empire still haunted by the blood of his predecessor. Their wedding unfolded like a pageant of divine restoration. The Senate assembled, priests burned incense to Juno, and musicians filled the air with lyres and flutes. Messalina walked the aisle of the Palatine Palace, draped in silk white as moonlight, her golden hair crowned with violets, the symbol of fertility. To the Roman crowd below, it was a spectacle of renewal, a fresh young empress to restore virtue and lineage, a union that would cleanse the sins of Caligula's Rome. But those who looked closely might have seen something colder in her eyes, a glint not of innocence, but of calculation. Beneath the garlands and hymns, there pulsed a hunger too ancient and too deep to belong to a child. Messalina, pale-skinned and radiant, soon became the face of Roman beauty, the empire's living ornament. She appeared beside Claudius during ceremonies, her expression carved in marble grace. She bore him 2 children and accepted the praise of poets who hailed her as the ideal matrona, the perfect Roman wife. Yet behind that veil of virtue, a darker rhythm beat. Rome demanded chastity, and she craved chaos. While statues of the gods looked down from gilded ceilings, she began to imagine what it would feel like to defy them, to mock the very purity that Rome adored her for. For beneath her jeweled exterior, Messalina was not content with the stillness of obedience. Power whispered to her in secret, not the power of armies or decrees, but of something more primal, the power to dominate hearts, to ruin men, to twist the sanctity of empire into her own pleasure. And so, even as Rome celebrated its young empress as the savior of morality, its destruction had already begun in her heartbeat. When the sun sank behind the Palatine Hill, the marble empire that praised purity slipped into shadow. Rome never truly slept. It only changed its mask. And when darkness swallowed the city, the true Messalina awoke. By day she was the image of virtue, the emperor's wife, mother of his heirs, the jewel of the imperial court. But as night fell, she shed her silk robes for rags, painting her cheeks with the same rouge worn by Rome's lowest women. The air of jasmine and incense that followed her in daylight was replaced by something harsher, cheap perfume, sweat and smoke. Through the back corridors of the palace, she slipped unnoticed into the streets, a golden empress hidden in filth. Lanterns flickered across the Subura district, Rome's slum of vice and noise. It was a place the noble dared not tread, a maze of taverns, brothels, and cries that echoed until dawn. There men came to forget their duties, their wives, their gods. Among them moved Messalina, her violet wreath traded for tangled hair, her soft hands stained with grime. Ancient chroniclers whisper that she did not simply visit these brothels, she worked in them. She competed openly with the prostitutes of Rome, boasting that no woman alive could equal her endurance or appetite. Imagine the horror of a senator, drunk and desperate, parting a curtain to find his empress, the wife of Caesar, waiting for him in the dim glow of oil lamps. For a moment he might think it a dream, until her eyes met his and the truth froze his blood. But this was not humiliation for her. It was rebellion. Messalina was not driven by desire alone. She sought power through degradation. Every man who saw her, everyone who yielded became her subject in a kingdom of shame. She defied the gods by desecrating what they held sacred. In those alleys, she ruled without the Senate, without the army, without the emperor. And as the nights passed, her defiance became an addiction. The greater the sin, the sweeter the triumph. The more she mocked Rome's ideals, the stronger she felt, not as Claudius's consort, but as something older, darker, almost divine. By dawn, she would wash away the scent of lust, return through the marble gates, and sit once more beside her husband, serene, pure, untouchable. No one dared suspect that the woman smiling behind the imperial veil was the same creature who prowled the streets of the Subura. Rome believed its empress embodied virtue. Only the night knew the truth, that its most sacred woman had become its most dangerous. By day, the imperial palace stood as the very image of divine order, its marble corridors radiant with sunlight, its fountains whispering peace. But when night returned to Rome, those same halls became the palace of sin, a place where virtue gasped its last breath under silken veils and dripping wine. Messalina, the girl who once walked as Rome's promise, now ruled its corruption. The empress who smiled beside Claudius in daylight became a high priestess of vice by torchlight. The same marble that had heard the oaths of senators now echoed with laughter, music, and cries that no prayer could drown. Banquets began as innocent feasts. Senators, generals, and their wives would arrive in splendid robes, invited by imperial decree. They reclined on silk couches embroidered with gold thread, golden platters carried by slaves laden with honeyed figs, oysters, and roasted dormice dripping with oil. Perfume misted the air, wine poured without end, yet beneath that elegance lay terror, for none knew what games the empress would command. Messalina's eyes sparkled like gems in the torchlight. Her voice, soft as silk, could freeze a man's heart with a single command. She summoned gladiators fresh from the arena, chained captives from distant provinces, even noble youths barely past childhood. They were all her instruments, her playthings in the grand theatre of humiliation. Every feast grew more unholy than the last. A senator's wife might find herself paired with a slave for the empress's amusement. Priests of Jupiter were ordered to perform grotesque rituals twisted into parody. The mighty and the powerless mingled under her gaze, equal only in their shame. And then came the contest that sealed her legend. Messalina challenged Scylla, Rome's most famed courtesan, a woman celebrated for beauty, stamina, and art, the wager who could endure more admirers before dawn. The palace gathered in horrified silence as the spectacle began. Hour after hour passed. Servants replaced lamps. Perfume turned to smoke. At dawn, Scylla collapsed, her body broken, her pride destroyed. Messalina, pale but smiling, rose victorious. Her golden hair glistened with sweat and triumph as she demanded her audience's silence. There was no cheer, no applause, only the heavy breathing of witnesses who dared not meet her gaze. As dawn spilled across the marble floors, the air reeked of wine, fear, and decay. The empress stood above them all, radiant and terrible, not a wife, not a queen, but a goddess of ruin, crowned in the ashes of Roman virtue. In her palace, the empire's heart no longer beat with honor, only with the rhythm of her corruption. Messalina's desires, once private indulgence, soon became something far more dangerous. Pleasure had turned into a weapon, sharper than any dagger in the Senate. She learned that Rome's proudest men could be broken not through force or exile, but through humiliation. A wound to pride, she realized, never healed. In secret, she established her new domain, a lavish villa near the Campus Martius, draped in red silk and guarded by silence. To outsiders, it seemed a sanctuary for the imperial circle. In truth, it was the beating heart of her empire of corruption, an imperial brothel disguised as pleasure. Here she summoned both the highborn and the low. Aristocratic women, terrified of scandal, were coerced into attending her gatherings. Generals and senators received gilded invitations they could not refuse, unaware they were walking into a trap. Once inside, they found themselves surrounded by music, laughter, and the intoxicating scent of myrrh. Yet behind the curtains and shadows, Messalina watched everything. Her attendants and slaves loyal only to her recorded each whispered confession, every trembling moment of disgrace. What began as temptation ended in blackmail. Rome's elite, the very men sworn to defend its virtue, were now prisoners of their own shame. Governors pledged their loyalty not to the emperor, but to her. Merchants offered bribes for silence. Even generals, hardened by war, submitted to her will, afraid their secrets would destroy them. Messalina ruled not from a throne, but from the shadows, her empire bound together by fear and humiliation. One soldier who escaped her villa later confessed, "Blood dries. Shame never does." It was a sentence that defined her reign. She discovered that a man stripped of honor became easier to command than one defeated in battle. Soon even religion was drawn into her web. Priests were forced to attend her secret feasts, their sacred vestments traded for ridicule. Messalina presided over it all like a queen of corruption, her golden hair glimmering in torchlight, her smile masking a predator's mind, and yet she never raised a sword, never spilled a drop of blood. Her victories were silent. Every night she added another name to her hidden list, another soul chained not by iron, but by disgrace. As Rome slept beneath its marble splendor, its true ruler was not Claudius, nor the Senate. It was the young empress whose laughter echoed behind closed doors, the woman who discovered that shame could conquer an empire where legions could not. As her power over Rome deepened, Messalina no longer saw herself as mortal. Her beauty, her influence, her ability to bend the proudest men in the empire to her will, it convinced her she was more than a woman. She began to imagine herself divine. The imperial villa, once a stage for indulgence, became a temple of corruption. At midnight, the empress would emerge in shimmering robes of gold and ivory, her hair crowned with roses, her skin gleaming under torchlight. Sometimes she appeared as Venus, goddess of love, other times as Bacchus, lord of wine and ecstasy. Behind her came priests, courtiers and senators' wives, all forced to join her unholy ceremonies. Music filled the marble halls, the low hum of flutes, the rhythm of drums echoing through the night. Incense burned thick as fog, blurring faces, softening boundaries between pleasure and shame. She commanded her guests to honor the gods not with prayer, but with performance. Each ritual spiraled into chaos, laughter, shouting, and the clashing of cups, as if the empire itself had lost its sanity. The Roman world, once built on discipline and order, now stood transfixed before its empress turned idol. Those who refused her commands vanished. Those who obeyed were destroyed in subtler ways. To defy her was to risk death. To obey her was to lose one's soul. Messalina found new amusement in cruelty disguised as ceremony. She summoned enemies, rival senators, feuding generals, and paired them together in public acts of humiliation. Men who had commanded legions now knelt trembling under her gaze. Noble wives, draped in jewels, were forced to dance for Rome's elite while their husbands watched in silence. Each night broke another fragment of Rome's dignity. The priests of Jupiter, once symbols of purity, now stood helpless as the empress turned sacred rites into mockery. She draped herself in their vestments, poured wine over altars, and declared herself the true goddess of Rome, not of virtue, but of desire. Whispers spread through the empire that the gods had abandoned Rome, that Venus herself had been replaced by a mortal queen of vice. Yet in the flicker of torchlight, Messalina smiled. She reveled in the power to twist faith into spectacle, to watch fear and devotion intertwine before her feet. In those fevered nights, Rome's heart no longer beat for its gods or its emperor. It beat for her, the empress who dared to crown herself divine, standing triumphant above the ruins of morality. And so, amid the perfumes and the prayers, the empire began to worship its own corruption. Messalina's empire of indulgence had grown too vast to hide. What began as whispered gossip within the palace now spread like poison through the veins of Rome. Her reign of pleasure, her empire of shame, it had become the beating heart of corruption. And with each passing night, that heart rotted the empire from within. The Senate, once Rome's voice of power and reason, fell silent. Men who had once thundered with speeches now averted their eyes. They knew that one word against the empress could bring their secrets to light. Every senator, every noble carried the same fear. Somewhere in Messalina's villa, their shame had been recorded. Governors were no longer chosen for their skill or loyalty, but for their obedience. The empire's laws bent beneath her will. Even Claudius, the emperor himself, seemed blind, or perhaps unwilling to see the truth. Some said he was weak. Others whispered that he feared her. Whatever the reason, the throne had become a puppet seat, and the empress its hidden master. Beyond the marble walls, Rome's soldiers murmured. In the barracks and camps, in the dusty provinces and along the frontiers, rumors burned like wildfire. Men spoke of comrades summoned to the imperial villa, ordered to appear before the empress, only to be stripped not of rank, but of dignity. For the Roman soldier, humiliation was a punishment worse than the sword. They had faced barbarian axes, endured plague and famine, but nothing wounded them more deeply than dishonor. The idea that the woman who ruled them, the wife of Caesar himself, mocked their pride shattered their faith in the empire they fought for. Discipline faltered. Commanders hesitated to enforce order. Loyalty, once Rome's unshakable pillar, began to crumble. Legions that had conquered the world now whispered behind closed doors, their oaths growing hollow, and as the empress's feasts continued under the torchlight, the empire's strength dissolved into wine and silence. Rome, the city that had outlived tyrants, fires, and invasions, now faced a quieter doom. No enemy army breached its walls. No foreign general plotted its fall. Instead, it was undone by whispers, fear, and the slow corruption of its soul. Messalina had discovered the one weapon capable of toppling an empire: shame. The marble still gleamed. The banners still flew. But behind the golden facade, the empire's heart was decaying, not from war or plague, but from the hunger of a single woman whose desires had become Rome's undoing. Rome had survived the sword. But could it survive her? By the year 48 CE, Messalina had conquered everything: Rome's laws, its men, its morals. But her hunger had grown monstrous. No longer content to rule from the shadows, she reached for something unthinkable: open defiance of the empire itself. When Emperor Claudius departed for Ostia to oversee public works, she saw her moment. The empress gathered her court, her priests, and her lover, Gaius Silius, a handsome senator with ambition to match her madness. Together they planned a wedding. Not a secret oath whispered in candlelight, but a public ceremony, sanctified by Rome's own priests. On the appointed day, the streets of the capital shimmered in confusion. Invitations had been sent. Guests had arrived. They thought it was another imperial celebration, perhaps a feast in honor of the gods. Instead, they found Messalina standing in a bridal gown of ivory silk, crowned in violets, her golden hair shining like the dawn. Beside her stood Silius, dressed as a groom. The ceremony unfolded with eerie precision. Priests blessed the union. Witnesses signed contracts. Vows were spoken. Rings exchanged. Every symbol of Roman matrimony was invoked, even as the true husband of the bride, Emperor Claudius, lived and breathed elsewhere. By Roman law, this was no act of adultery. It was bigamy and treason. For an empress to wed another man while her husband still reigned was to challenge the very gods of Rome. The empire itself seemed to shudder. Messalina, however, stood radiant. Her smile was not of love but of conquest. In that moment, she was no longer merely a woman. She was a force of defiance against the moral and divine order of Rome. Whether driven by lust, arrogance, or the thrill of destruction, she had crossed the final threshold from sin to rebellion. Rumors spread like wildfire. Senators fled their homes. Priests tore their vestments. Citizens whispered that the gods would strike the city down before dawn. Some believed it was a symbolic act. Others swore Messalina truly meant to replace Claudius, crowning Silius emperor beside her. But her empire of lust had become an empire of death. What began as desire had turned into delirium. Her festival of pleasure now reeked of prophecy, that the woman who made Rome tremble would soon fall by the same madness that had raised her. In her mind, it was not betrayal. It was triumph. A final ritual where she, the goddess of vice, would crown herself queen of Rome's ruin. The wedding bells still echoed through the streets, when the city realized it had witnessed not a union, but the beginning of an execution. The wedding bells had barely faded when the whispers reached Ostia. At first, Emperor Claudius dismissed them with weary laughter. His wife married? It was too absurd to believe. But then came the witnesses, officials bearing contracts sealed with the imperial insignia, priests trembling as they swore what they had seen. When the truth became undeniable, laughter curdled into rage. The emperor's humiliation was complete. The world's most powerful man had been mocked before the gods and his own senate. Rome roared with scandal. The streets buzzed with the word that its empress had crowned herself another man's bride. Claudius, pale with fury, ordered his soldiers to march for the capital. Behind him trailed not only his legions, but the wrath of a betrayed empire. In Rome, panic erupted. Messalina's allies fled, tearing their togas, burning letters, destroying every trace of her rule. Gaius Silius, the lover who had dared to stand beside her, was seized and executed before the sun had set. His blood washed the marble steps of the Forum. Messalina herself was found in the gardens of her palace, the same gardens where she had once ruled in triumph, where laughter, music, and sin had once filled the air. Now silence hung heavy. She was no longer the goddess of Rome, only a trembling woman dressed in torn silk, her crown of roses crushed into the earth. When the soldiers approached, she fell to her knees. She begged for mercy, pleaded for her children's lives, and even tried to take her own, but her hand failed her. The same woman who had ruled through fear could not face death with courage. In the end, it was a nameless soldier who carried out the emperor's command. One quick thrust, and the empress who had enslaved Rome through shame fell into the dust she had once commanded. Her body was left unburied until nightfall. Her statues were torn down, her portrait smashed. Her name, once whispered with awe and desire, was stricken from every record. Damnatio memoriae, the curse of oblivion. But Rome could not forget. Even as her marble likenesses crumbled, her legend lived on, not in praise, but in warning. The Palatine ruins still murmur her story to those who listen. The empress who turned lust into law, pleasure into politics, and shame into empire. For in the end, Rome did not fall to her enemies. It fell, if only for a moment, to one woman's hunger and the rot she carried within her bedchamber.